Fabulous with Vips and Vicky. The ThinqShift podcast for professionals who aspire to be fabulous leaders. Those who not only succeed, but also purposefully seek to reinvent the world.
We hear the word transparency a lot in organizations. Hardly a day goes by that a leader doesn't state that they value transparency. Transparency has become a top priority in organizations around the world. Transparency in leadership, it's often hailed as the cornerstone of trust and accountability. It's seen as improving speed and quality of decision-making by broadening the number of people involved to make smarter decisions and increase buy-in. But what Vips and I are going to be discussing today, is it always as beneficial as it seems? In this episode, we'll explore the double-edged sword of transparency within organizations, uncovering its potential pitfalls and unintended consequences. Vips, this is going to be exciting.
Yeah, I think it's another one that sounds so, it sounds like there's just one right answer. Be transparent equals good. Don't be transparent equals bad. And it's probably not that simple. In fact, it's certainly not that simple.
Yeah, fits very nicely for our theme of this year, which is all about it's not that simple.
Yeah.
So if we start with a definition of transparency within an organization, most people would understand it to mean it's the practice of openly and clearly sharing information and decisions with employees with the goal of building trust, enhancing accountability, and creating a culture of openness and collaboration. I think we'd all agree with that. And we know the appeal. If you want to understand what motivates and engages employees, we know that humans are inherently social. Our brains are highly attuned to social information. We're sensitive to social threats and rewards. Things like certainty, things like fairness, which we discussed in the last episode. And so these things create a desire, an innate desire for transparency, because transparency feels like if I understand everything, it's going to create a sense of certainty, so I know what's going on. It's going to create a sense of fairness, so I can see how decisions are made. And we all have this desire for equitable treatment, and a lack of transparency can threaten that. And then we amplify that with transparency in the digital age, where employee expectations are demanding openness because they're seeing transparency in every other avenue of their lives. And so they can also amplify what they feel via social media platforms. So there's so many examples of this that we see that we'll touch on as we go through this. But Vips, this is one of those things that, sounds like a bit of a no-brainer. We generally see it as a good thing when buyers and sellers rate each other on Uber, on Airbnb, and we kind of get a sense of what's going on. But, is it, Vips?
I don't know. I don't think it's that straightforward. To me, it's lazy. There's a lot of laziness that comes in with that, right? I mean, just sort based on 4 stars and above. Therefore, that must be good, But I mean, there's a little bit of, do you trust the source as well? I mean, who the hell knows who's rating those things? And these days, most of those things are bot driven rather than human driven. So, I guess, when you're talking in that context, I think it's very easy to manipulate as well. But if I just go back to your, your definition, I found it interesting the way you expressed it. I think you described as the practice of openly and clearly sharing information and decisions with employees with the goal of building trust. You can have that goal till you're blue in the face. The person you're talking to might not care. Right? The reason why I bring that up, I'm not being facetious. I'm bringing it up because in my experience, what you tend to find is people want transparency around the things that they feel threatened or scared about because they want more understanding. But the problem is one person's desire for transparency, if you like, is another person's, oh my God, I'll switch off and do 16 other emails and that's an hour of my life I'll never get back, And so I think this concept of transparency, in the real world is a much more individual or personalized thing than, let's just be transparent and open to everyone about everything and suddenly everything will be okay. Because I think it can cause, chaos as well.
Yeah.
And you also can't be sure, not be sure, but you can't even predict how a particular group is going to react on a given day to something that might be too much information.
And we touched on this, you spot on, Vips. We touched on this in the last episode where we discussed fairness. We hear it all the time from employees. If there's a layoff situation, a reduction in force situation, well, we want to know, like, what are the business conditions and what's going on, and how do we feel about all this? But then when they do know, then they get really scared and worried and anxious about what does it mean to them. And then they freak out for weeks and months, and they're not productive, while the mechanics of the process gets worked out. And in the end, it's not a great thing anyway, whether they are laid off or not laid off. If they are, then they've got to deal with that. If they're not, then they've got remainers guilt and, all of that stuff. And so, hopefully as everybody's listening, you're thinking about, is that a better situation, or is it better to have enough of a heads up so you can process and go through the cycles of grief correctly, versus knowing everything about a business environment, warts and all, in a role where you have very little ability to impact it if you're further down the chain?
Yeah, the way I almost think of it, this topic is, it's almost like if you imagine kindergarten, then elementary school, then high school, then college, then postgrad, right? I think there's like it's almost like you have to have a level of accumulated knowledge in the area in which you're seeking transparent. Like, the level of transparency that someone needs at high school is not the same as someone needs at PhD level. Yeah. And I think because you have more context, you have more background, you have more accumulated
Life
knowledge,
experience.
and experience. Yeah. And I think the more of that you have, the more transparency you can tolerate. Yeah, maybe it's like lactose. you can tolerate it more if you have more knowledge. Yeah. And I think that, to me, is probably the crux of it. Like, a little bit of information can be used to do tremendous harm if you don't know how to ingest, interpret, understand it. So to me, it's a combination of how much knowledge do you have that earns you the right for increasing levels of transparency, if you like? And then secondly, do you really have the emotional fortitude to be able to handle whatever it is that you hear? Because if you don't have the ability to compartmentalize, keep those things in perspective, it will almost freak you. It will almost certainly freak you out more than reassure you.
Yeah. And Vips, as you're saying that, it also comes to me, also life experience. If you've lived through the dot-com bubble burst, if you lived through 2008, if you lived through, the different recessions and the different world events that have happened that have caused companies to have very extreme reactions, you've got, a mechanism potentially for having the emotional fortitude because you've lived through it and you're going to survive. Not necessarily survive in that you'll definitely have the same job or situation that you're in, but whatever happens, you'll get through it because you've lived through it already.
Yeah. And I also think a lot of the topics that people want transparency on are just inherently complex. I mean, let's take a current one that, it's in the news right now because of Amazon, return to work, right? You must come back to the office 5 days from whatever it is, January 2025 or whatever, right? No amount of being transparent about the reasons for that are going to satisfy someone who wants to live wherever they're living right now and sees that as an affront to the reason why they, sees it as an injustice or reneging on a agreement. Yeah. And so, I personally, I can see it from both sides, right? I can see it from the employee perspective, but I can also see it from the manager or the bosses or the executive leadership's perspective, which is, at some level, it's how much misery do I want to tolerate? Now, how much can I take? And that's, on both sides of the equation.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that just gets lost, against the backdrop of, these really complex terms that we find ourselves labeling as inherently good or inherently bad. And then you kind of end up, it's like playing whack-a-mole. You solve one thing and another problem just pops up somewhere else.
Okay. So we touched on this idea of transparency can lead to increased anxiety, depending on how you how you experience it. So what are some other sort of the dark side and unintended consequences?
Rumors. And I guess that works in both cases. Misinterpretation means they said this, I thought they said this, they shared this, but this means this to me. So distraction. Yeah. Um, and I think, we'll probably get into this a little bit later. I think the big one, like the big one, is the idea of, transparency runs kind of, polar opposites to privacy
Say more,
fundamentally.
Vips.
Okay, well, I work with you, Vicky, so I feel you should be transparent with me. So I should see all your web history for the last 5 years.
It's
Right?
pretty boring, Vips.
It might be pretty boring, right? But I can imagine some of our friends have slightly colorful histories, right? But my point is, it's a completely
Yeah. Yeah,
normative
yeah, yeah, yeah.
thing that determines what
Yeah.
constitutes something that should be transparent versus things that shouldn't be transparent, or made available,
And
and it
as you said
changes.
that, as you said that, I was thinking about personal relationships,
Yeah,
family relationships. In that example, if we're completely transparent, let me see your cell phone texts and where have you been, and that kind of moves into more of the trust issues and everything
but I'll
else.
tell you, I'll give you a completely different lens on it. Okay, if I'm being completely transparent, I should have no issue putting all of our knowledge inside ChatGPT and allowing them to train those models. I would, on the other side, you can call that intellectual theft.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, yeah,
so again, a lot depends on ultimately where the balance of interests and normative beliefs happen to be, and maybe it's worth, Vicky, just spending some time on kind of areas where we're generally what's driving the desire for more transparency in businesses, particularly,
hmm hmm
and probably just worth, just in summary, it's things like striking that balance between, customer data, business insights, and protecting user privacy. So I think you're seeing this play out, particularly in Europe with GDPR and so forth, where we're trying to find these kind of new legal ways of trying to balance the idea of everything's available versus what should be private. But
hmm
also things like consumers, people like you and me increasingly want transparency in terms of where our products and services come from. Are they being ethically sourced? Are the labor practices good? Um, without some visibility of the supply chain, it becomes impossible to do that. So that's an area that, is definitely on the wave that's saying more transparency, please, if you will.
hmm hmm
I think similarly, environment, you know, are you operating in a sustainable way? Are, companies are being asked to publish their environmental footprint, CO2 footprint, waste footprint, carbon emissions footprint, whatever it may be. Okay. All of these sorts of things are driving, particularly for large companies that may have a lot of waste and a lot of pollution in their industrial process. That's something they might not want to be fully transparent about. Okay. I think investors, financial reporting, things, are you being truly accurate with the numbers, or are you hiding numbers inside? Just joke, this is not, I'm not to call out anyone in particular, but I think even today, like Apple don't split out Apple Watch sales, because I think it all comes as part of accessories, or wearables. I
hmm
can't remember, right? So, from which might be for good reason, by the way. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm just saying that there's always going to be a desire to want to dig further and deeper in, and there's also going to be good reasons from a maybe from a corporate secrets point of view, or from a product development point of view, or from a market sensitive IP point of view, to not be so transparent about those things.
hmm
Yeah.
hmm
And I know these
And as
aren't so
you,
much employee driven, but I think it's these things. Corporate governance is the last one, by the way. Shareholders are kind of increasingly skeptical of how companies are managed, predominantly because CEOs earn so much money now, right? That there's more, we need some more scrutiny over
yeah,
what they're doing. And
yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
I think when you kind of add all that stuff up, I think it creates a macro or an external um, sort of pressure for transparency as a way of accountability, yeah, or creating more accountability. So I think that's, my point is, I think there's that those are legitimate, if you will, drivers, if you like, for, and that's not so much from an employee point of view, but from a corporate standpoint as well.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
then so again,
Phipps, as you were saying that, I was thinking about that. There was a phase, probably, I don't know, probably over 10 years ago now, I'd say, where salary transparency became the big thing. Do you remember that? Where
yep,
organizations were publishing salaries and people wanted that, and that just backfired in all sorts of horrible ways.
yep.
When there was no goodness about that, but the intention behind it was good in order to share a fair and transparent model. But as we discussed last episode, what's fair to one person is not fair to somebody else when you actually see the performance that somebody's doing day to day.
And that to me is a good example of, if you like, in order to truly understand and be able to handle that kind of transparency, you kind of have to have PhD level understanding of compensation structures, differentials, how salaries evolve over time, the genuine market value for skills and how they change over time. Because most people don't want that. Most people just want to think that they're just going to be earning more forevermore, right? And that's
Yeah.
that's at least in the professional environment, it's very much like that. So
And also what companies value. It's not just what gets done, but how it gets done,
yeah,
and the leadership competencies, which may
right.
not be evident to you as a colleague, that may
It's
be
so
valuable to the
many.
executives.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, see that to me, right? That drive for transparency around salaries, that to me is a really good example of, it's a little bit like, knowing a tomato is a fruit, but then not putting it in fruit salad. It was just never a wise thing to do. It may have, it was just a dumb thing to do, right? But yeah,
I love it.
we get caught up in these fads, and I think we don't realize that, um, we can claim some sort of moral or utopian high ground, but just creating rods for our own back, and in a way that just can't work. Not because the intention is poor.
And we even had an example of this when we were building that fabulous company in London, where we did a high potential talent program, which we made transparent based on criteria and who was in it and who was out of it, and criteria to get in and criteria to get out. And it was a very collaborative, open, transparent culture.
Yeah,
Who
until you're
should
not
have
on
been
the
able to
list.
handle that until you get on the list and can then get off the
Yeah,
list.
yeah,
It
yeah.
was all sorts of badness that came from that we couldn't anticipate, with all sorts of good intention. So.
Yeah, and I think that, but then then it becomes a leadership issue, and how do you stick to your guns, or not,
Yeah, yeah.
right? I think then it becomes, but I think to me it's really interesting, this topic, and then go the other side, and let's talk about when you absolutely don't want transparency, trade secrets. Right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I don't know. I pick on Apple again just because we used them earlier, right? I don't know how many billions they spend on R&D on new products, right? It's important that those things stay secret because they need 5, 10, 15 years of revenue to make up for the R&D investment that they put in, or at least that's what they'll tell you. Okay. And so those become important. You can add strategic plans to that. How am I, how is an organization positioning itself in the market, or new product launches or stuff like that? That might be an area where you don't want people to know about it until you're ready for them to know about it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
How about negotiating, selling a company, buying a company? Those things can be stock sensitive or stock price sensitive. Those could be insider trading sensitive. There's a whole host of sort of, you don't want transparency in that, because it could also fall through. You can
Yeah.
raise expectations or decrease, all these things can happen. What about employee privacy? Right? Should I be transparent every time, with performance information? Should I be completely transparent with, I don't know, inappropriate conduct information transparently on a bulletin board? I mean, those things can victimize someone as well,
Mm-hmm.
particularly if it was a mistake. On the other hand, someone would say, well, we had a right to know because they were on my team, right? That kind of thing. And that's before you get into the salary information and stuff like that. And I guess the last one is security. What about, I mean, whether it be physical security or cyber security or vulnerabilities, that probably isn't something you want to scream from the top of the rooftops. so they can be exploited
Yeah.
in your own organization or in your own world, So it's just worth pointing out that I don't think any of us would disagree. Sorry, that those things should be, you shouldn't be so transparent about those things. But at the same time, so it's always going to be a balancing act, I guess, is the point I'm trying to get across.
Yeah. So if you're an employee and you've listened to this, really the key takeaway is that it might not be the best to have the desire to know the full details of how the organization is doing, because you also don't want to be fully held accountable for the results and the ups and downs in it. Instead, a better way to look at it is to know enough to do your job well and have the right to know how it's going to impact you as things are changing, but let somebody else who has the broader perspective and the role to process and manage information at a higher level and let you know when it's going to impact you.
Right. And that is, to me, the $64,000 question, which is that only works if you have good managers and good leaders who have high levels of trust based on some level of personal power, content power, or positional power, right? You have to trust those folks. Otherwise, why would you believe them? And that to me is where I think as we've become kind of more, I don't know, more transaction orientated, maybe more skeptical of our managers or our leaders, or quite frankly, our managers and leaders not doing a particularly good job. Okay, I think it causes real issues, because if you feel like I'm not going to treat you fairly, no matter what, then I'm going to drive for more transparency and not going to take your word for it because I don't believe you. I think you're, I think you're talking nonsense. Then I'm that's not going to work. So this is another reason why you can't quantify this. We always say it, the more trust you create as a leader, the better you communicate, the more people experience you as authentic, and all these sorts of language. That's where you benefit. Now you can get away with a lot less transparency because people are going to trust you anyway. Because it's like, I trust Vicky. She'll let me know when I need to know, right? But if I don't trust you, then that's broken.
Yeah, she has my back. She knows my context. She knows when I need to have some information, when I don't.
Yeah,
that's powerful.
But when I do think about it, there are things that to me, the way I look at this topic is it's one of these things that you're always going to have to iterate on, refine on, work on. I don't think it's I don't think you can just solve it.
Yeah,
it's a moving object constantly.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So, Vips, are we ready to move into what people can do about it?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Well, I guess there's people and then there's organizations, right? I think that's probably two ways of looking at it.
Yeah. So, in a very simplistic way, you could look at it as a number of choices. Do I go for more of a full transparency route and have an open sharing experience as an executive, recognizing the downstream complications of everything we've just discussed? Or do I go for more of a minimal transparency posture, sharing when something's going to impact the individuals and giving them enough of a heads up? Or am I more in the middle somewhere, a bit of a selective transparency where I'm trying to balance confidentiality with employee trust and trying to get that right, which is a fine line to balance. Should we dive into those, or is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I think we should dive into those. I think the answer, but just cut to the chase, though. I think your answer has to be the middle one, because I think the others are almost too binary, and therefore it's too easy to be experienced as a hypocrite if you label yourself as being all about transparency or all about whatever. I think it diminishes the complexity of the topic and makes you seem like a low sophistication manager or leader.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into a little bit more. So if you decide to take the posture of full transparency because it sits with you as one of your values and drivers and your feeling of authenticity and openness. So what we're really saying, if you decide to take that posture, even if you decide there's certain topics that are off limits because of privacy and all the things we talked about, you've really got to prepare yourself as a leader for the emotional fortitude of the backlash of how people are going to respond to everything you share. Some people will, we've discussed the the third rule. A bunch of people will love that you've been so open and transparent. A bunch of people will absolutely fall to pieces, and a bunch of people will kind of wait and see with it all. But regardless, when you think about the amplitude and the exponential noise that's going to get created in the organization, and the lack of productivity, even with good things around transparency, it's a lot to manage, and you have to, as a leader, be able to ingest all that energy and emotion that's going to come from that, as well as doing everything you need to do from a very practical, logical business perspective. That's a lot for most leaders.
Oh, yeah. And what I would say, you can layer that, though, because I think there's some situations where it's easier and some situations where it's harder. So if we go back to the way we think about organizations, are they in starting? Are they in scaling? Are they in striving? Are they in thriving? If you're in starting, you can actually do that, right? You can, like, if you're literally, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people, right? You can do that. You can actually be very transparent, and it doesn't cost you that much, because what you're really doing, and this is a thorny topic as well. What you're going to do is you're only going to hire people who have that tolerance and fortitude anyway, which can also get you into different issues, right? Because now you might be hiring for the ability to be resilient and tolerant of that kind of environment, rather than the skills and the ability to do the job. Yeah. Meaning your ability to function in that environment becomes a lot more important than anything you have on your resume. Yeah. And that, that's a different type of legal problem, potentially. And there's fraught with challenges.
That's what you went in starting, as someone to bind to your vision, be all in, jack of all trades, help you build the thing, get it to market, test it.
But in that world, you don't end up with a third, right? In that world, you can stack the deck in your favor because the numbers are so small. But by the time you get to scaling, and what you said, it holds true.
And in starting, everybody wants to be all in because that's what they signed up for, is the chaos.
Yeah. And in fact, what's going to happen if you did that and then you get to scaling, what you're going to find is just the scale of it then means that everyone can't know everything that's going on. And then everyone's going to complain that we're not as transparent as we used to be, right? So the culture's changed. We're a terrible organization now. We're not what we used to be, that kind of stuff, right? And so it will cause the problem with taking either of those extreme positions, too much transparency or too little transparency in startup, is it's going to show up in the proportion of staff you will lose when you go from starting to scaling.
So let's look at it the other way. So you're starting and you decide to be less transparent.
Yeah.
So you focus the team on getting the thing to market as quickly as possible to test the concept, but you try and shield them from as much noise as possible. Yep. What then happens?
That would be called creating focus and setting clear priorities, right? I mean, that's the other way of saying it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what's going to actually happen is you're going to end up with a reasonably authoritative or authoritarian command and control kind of structure is what you're going to end up with. And what that's going to do is it's going to give you super fast decision making, even if it's the wrong decisions. Okay. You're not going to lean so much on collaboration and consensus building because that's slow. And then what's going to happen then is when you hit scaling, what's going to happen is you're just a critical bottleneck for everything at that point. And then you need more teaming and you need more collaboration and you need people to own their areas and so forth. So you have to fire a bunch of people and hire a bunch of people, right? So however you look at it, when you take those two extremes, it just increases the pain in the transition point in the circle of self.
And fire yourself, because now you're the bottleneck.
And fire yourself. Yeah.
Which is the hardest thing to do.
Or reinvent yourself.
Yeah.
Which is hard.
Yeah. Which is really hard. Yeah.
Which is really, really hard.
We see leaders really struggle with that.
Yeah. But I think the truth is, once you get beyond startup, though, what you say holds true. And to me, this is the kind of genetic thing that's very hard to change inside an organization after the cast has been set.
Yeah.
It will only be incrementally more transparent or incrementally more private, if you like. And I think then what drives it is more kind of how well you're doing. So put simply, if you're in a period of where you're doing really well as an organization, I mean financially and so forth, then you'll find that collaboration, trust, increasing transparency is all good because it's not costing you much. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But if you're in a downturn or in a lean phase, okay, then the speed and efficiency of decision making becomes a lot more important than transparency and consensus building, collaboration, that sort of thing. Okay. and then you're going to find that, I didn't know about that. No one told me. Why did that decision get made? That sort of stuff. So I think I think the key point to get out for me is this is something to be very pragmatic about and see as an adaptability challenge based on the context of where your company finds itself, rather than just inherently good or inherently bad.
So if we go for the selective transparency, where we're looking to balance confidentiality, focus, prioritization with employee trust, now it becomes how do we decide what to share with employees,
That's
what
right.
to keep
That's right.
confidential, to try and strive for a match between this degree of transparency and this degree of responsibility. So for instance, if everyone is responsible for customer service, then information on service levels and customer satisfaction should be shared.
Yeah.
Because that impacts them. But where you don't want transparency is in performance reviews or salary information or being selective about what is good to know about the market conditions, what's good to know about the company, so that people have a broader understanding but aren't freaking out because things are changing so much.
Yeah. I think you also have the very clear policies, like structured, like a bit like what you're describing. And I think people need to understand what the rules of the game are. These sorts of things we don't share. These sorts of things we do share. These sorts of things we share. These sorts of things we discuss. I think you have to almost you kind of have to force it with policy at the beginning to kind of what's what I'm looking for. To seed the culture
rules
in a particular way.
Yeah, set the ground rules. Like you're joining a company. This is how we operate. This is how we govern ourselves. This is what you can expect, what you can't expect, and why.
This, by the way, brings me to one of my pet peeves, right? Slightly tangential. And this is why, my view, particularly in the States, this is where I think onboarding just goes wrong. Yeah, because we think of onboarding as almost like an administrative HRE type of thing. Yeah. And so what happens is people end up setting the context of the organization they sold to the person during the recruitment process, as opposed to the reality of what is trying to be set from very senior execs. Okay. Mm-hmm. But a very senior execs want nothing to do with onboarding because that's whatever, not worth my time, low level, whatever. And it's a complete own goal, because now what's going to happen is the wrong sort of the wrong stakes in the ground are going to be put in, more or less an inception. And now you're kind of, you're going to be battling against that all the way through. And no one's even going to acknowledge this issue because it's not in HR and talents. Like from their perspective, they're doing a good job. Right?
It's not in the handbook.
Yeah, it's not in the but you wouldn't even know that it was disconnected. Is my point. Like it's not. No one's being bad. It's just you wouldn't even know. And
it's usually in those early days when that new hire feels like the employee contract is broken, because they start seeing things that either they didn't see in previous companies or doesn't sit well with them, because they've come in with expectations. They haven't asked the questions. The organization hasn't set clear rules of how it works, and it's just misery from then on.
Yep. I mean, that to me as a whole process area is kind of just broken. It's because we do it for efficiency more often than not in the US. In US companies, we think of it as something to do efficiently to get a bunch of things done, rather than we're seeding effectively the values and ethics of this person in this environment for as long as they're here. And if we get any of those assumptions wrong right now, we're just buying ourselves trauma 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months down the road. But at that point, it's a different part of HR or a different team or a different manager or whatever that has to deal with it. So you don't even know about it.
I'm just thinking of another podcast topic on how do you bring someone into an organization and really set them up for success.
Yeah, that domain, from a fabulous point of view, is something where it's almost like we've kind of lost the meaning because we've tried to optimize the process so much.
Yeah. Yeah. And push it down in the organization.
Yeah, and we've de-skilled it as well, I guess. Maybe AI is going to come along and seed it all perfectly for everyone shortly. That's a different conversation.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh dear.
All right, Vips. Any closing remarks?
No, I probably just all I would say is, um, just be careful. When you find yourself wanting more transparency over something, ask yourself, is it really going to be helpful for you to know more? Right?
Yeah.
I joke about this with my wife all the time, right? Like, I don't know if you guys have it, but there's like nextdoor.com and what have you, right? And you get alerts from them. And if you happen to be within, I don't know, 5 postal zones, you're going to get pinged every time there was a burglary or whatever, a car theft or whatever, right?
We absolutely have not turned that on because it's just so
Yeah,
much
it's
noise
mad, right? Now, you could argue that from a transparency point of view, it's all there, it's all for you, it keeps you better informed, whatever. But then the flip side of that is that's a lot of toxicity. Now I got to be scared of everyone. I'm thinking things a lot worse than they are, and that tends, in my mind, that stops me being optimistic and positive. And if you get negative and pessimistic about other human beings, that's generally when we end up dividing ourselves as people rather than uniting ourselves as people. Now I know there's other people out there who think that that information is so good because it makes me feel safe, right? I get it. I'm just saying you have to know what level of that you can tolerate. Otherwise it will absolutely distort your perspective.
And for me, I always go to the place of what's in my control and what's not in my control. And based on things that aren't in my control, which are all those things, I want to know the least amount possible to live a happy and harmonious life. So I don't want to live with the blinkers on.
Yeah.
But I also don't want to know every little thing because
But that's because you're fabulous, right? A lot of people out there who aren't fabulous, they have a much higher inflated view of the things they really have control over.
Yeah, which is very little.
Which is actually why they're miserable. It's why they're not fabulous, right? If you convince yourself you have more control over things than you really have control over, you will always feel like you're failing.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's a bit deep. I'm not sure if that's how we wanted to end this one. But...
All right, I'll take us home. So the key, as everyone's listening to this, is to ask yourself: are you ready to take on the responsibility that comes with full transparency? Whether that's in your personal life, as we just touched on, and the emotional drain that comes with that, whether it's in an organization and understanding all the nuances that come with hearing everything. Are you able to compartmentalize and put it into a bucket? Or are you willing to go to a place of, let me have the right amount of information that I need for what my job is, and if I'm not getting that directly from those around me, let me ask for that so I have what I need, but not be too open to wanting to know everything, because the downsides are pretty hard for leaders now. Leaders need to get smarter about when to open up and when to hold with information so they can get the benefits of being selectively transparent while mitigating the unintended noisy consequences. And our call to action is reflect on your transparency practices, both in terms of what you share and what you want to take in, and make informed choices that align with your goals, your leadership goals, and the organizational culture. And think about building your emotional fortitude to deal with what is an imperfect world with a lot more access to information and responsibility that comes with it, and to do that well. So with that, we bid you farewell, and until next time, stay fabulous.